April 14, 1943. FRY Court, Washington, D.C. The war in the Pacific was not a conflict of lines on a map, but a war of vast, empty spaces and the signals that filled them. Deep within the basement of the Navy Department, in a section known as OP-20G, the air was thick with the hum of tabulating machines and the smell of stale coffee. This was the home of MAGIC, the Allied project dedicated to breaking the highest-level Japanese naval codes. On this particular morning, a cryptanalyst sat staring at a decrypted intercept that had originated from the Japanese naval base at Truk. The message was encrypted in the JN25D code, the most secure variant of the Japanese Navy's operational cipher. As the letters began to form coherent Japanese words, and those words were translated into English, the room went silent. It was a detailed itinerary. It listed departure times, arrival times, and specific locations for an inspection tour scheduled for April 18th. But it was the name at the top of the itinerary that caused the blood to run cold. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The man who was, in the eyes of the American military and public, the living embodiment of the Japanese war effort. According to the intercept, Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul to Balala Airfield, a small island near Bougainville, to inspect forward positions and boost the morale of his troops following the crushing defeat at Guadalcanal. The information was so sensitive that it was hand-carried to Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor and eventually to the White House. The decision to act was not merely tactical, it was a strategic gamble of the highest order. If the Americans intercepted Yamamoto, the Japanese would know their codes were broken. They would change their ciphers, blinding the U.S. Navy just as the critical campaigns of 1943 were beginning. Yet the opportunity to remove the most brilliant strategic mind in the Japanese military was a temptation that could not be ignored. The order was given: get Yamamoto. April 17, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The mission was assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group, 13th Air Force. The task was technically impossible. To reach the intercept point over Bougainville and return to Guadalcanal, the aircraft would have to fly a round trip of nearly 1,000 miles. No standard Allied fighter in the Pacific had that kind of range. The only aircraft capable of the mission was the Lockheed P-38G Lightning. The P-38 was a twin-engine, twin-boom heavy fighter, distinctive for its speed and its concentrated firepower. Unlike the wing-mounted guns of the F-4F Wildcat or the P-40 Warhawk, the P-38's 4.50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon were located in the nose. This meant the pilot didn't have to worry about gun convergence. Wherever he pointed the nose, a devastating stream of lead and high explosives followed. To make the distance, the Lightnings would need to carry massive 165-gallon and 310-gallon drop tanks. Even then, the margin for error was non-existent. The flight would have to be flown at wave-top level, no more than 50 feet above the water, to avoid Japanese radar and coastal lookouts. They would have to maintain total radio silence, and most critically, they had to arrive at a precise point in the sky at a precise second. If they were 1 minute late, the target would be gone. Major John Mitchell, the commander of the 339th, spent the night of April 17th huddled over a navigational chart. He didn't use a computer or radar. He used a circular slide rule and a protractor. He plotted a dogleg course that took the squadron far out into the Solomon Sea, away from the slot, the heavily patrolled water corridor between the islands. He calculated the wind drift, the fuel consumption rates at low altitude, and the exact airspeed required. The plan called for 18 P-38s, 4 designated as the killer flight to focus solely on the bombers, and 14 as the cover flight to hold off the inevitable Zeke-0 escorts. April 18th, 1943, 0600 hours, Rabaul, New Britain. Admiral Yamamoto was a man of legendary punctuality. Despite the protestations of his staff, who feared the American air presence in the Solomons, Yamamoto insisted on following the itinerary to the minute. He wore his summer white service uniform, a stark contrast to the olive-drab flight suits of his pilots. At 6 a.m., 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers taxied down the runway at Rabaul. Yamamoto boarded the first, tail number 323. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, boarded the second, tail number 326. The Betty was a fast, long-range bomber, but it was notoriously vulnerable. Its large, unprotected fuel tanks led Allied pilots to nickname it the Type 1 lighter. One well-placed burst of incendiary rounds could turn the aircraft into a flying pyre. As the 2 bombers rose into the humid morning air, they were joined by 6 A-6M0 fighters. To Yamamoto, the escort seemed sufficient. He was flying over territory occupied by the Japanese, hundreds of miles from the nearest American base. He opened a folder of paperwork and began to work. unaware that 400 miles to the southeast, 18 twin-tailed ghosts were roaring off the dirt strip at Henderson Field. 7:30 hours, the Solomon Sea. The P-38s were flying so low that salt spray blurred the windscreens of the pilots. They were 150 miles offshore, skimming the whitecaps of the Pacific. In the cockpit of his P-38, Miss Virginia, Captain Rex Barber checked his watch. The heat in the cockpit was suffocating, and the drone of the twin Allison engines was hypnotic. To his left and right, the other three members of the killer flight, Tom Lanphier, Besby Holmes, and Raymond Hine, stayed tucked in close. They had been flying for over 2 hours in absolute silence. Navigating by dead reckoning over a featureless ocean requires a level of focus that exhausts a pilot more than combat itself. Every few minutes, Mitchell, leading the formation, would make a slight correction to the heading. They were flying at 200 miles per hour, just high enough to avoid hitting a rogue wave. At 9:30, Mitchell signaled the climb. They were approaching the coast of Bougainville. The P-38s pitched their noses up, trading their low-altitude stealth for tactical height. They climbed to 2,000 feet, their eyes scanning the horizon where the green jungle of the island met the blue of the sky. 9:34 hours, over Bougainville. Bogies, 11 o'clock, hi! The silence on the radio was shattered. There, exactly where Mitchell's math said they would be, were 2 Betty bombers and their fighter escort. Yamamoto was 2 minutes away from his destination. The Americans were 1 minute early. Mitchell ordered the drop tanks released. The heavy metal cylinders fell away, and the P-38s, suddenly light and nimble, surged forward. The cover flight clawed for altitude to engage the Zeros, while the 4 aircraft of the killer flight dived toward the bombers. The Japanese were caught in a state of total shock. There was no time to maneuver, no time to climb. The Zeros dived to intervene, but the P-38s were already in their firing runs. Captain Rex Barber banked his Lightning and lined up on the lead bomber, Yamamoto's aircraft. He waited until the Betty filled his entire windscreen. The concentrated fire of the P-38's nose guns tore into the bomber's right engine, and then the fuselage. Pieces of metal and glass flew off the Betty. Barber saw the engine begin to smoke, then erupt into flames. The bomber tilted, its wing clipping the jungle canopy. It disappeared into the dense greenery of Bougainville, followed a second later by a massive plume of black smoke and a dull orange explosion. Behind him, Tom Lanphier engaged the second bomber, carrying Admiral Ugaki. The second Betty dived toward the sea, hoping to use the water to escape, but it too was riddled with fire. It crashed into the ocean at high speed. Unlike Yamamoto, Admiral Ugaki would survive the crash, pulled from the wreckage by Japanese search parties. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. The P-38s, their fuel gauges dangerously low, immediately turned back toward the south. One P-38, piloted by Raymond Hine, was lost in the dogfight with the Zeros. The remaining 17 aircraft began the long, nervous flight back to Guadalcanal, wondering if they had actually killed the man they were sent for. The first of the P-38s appeared as silver specks over the horizon. As they touched down on the dirt runway, the ground crews noticed the empty pylons where the massive drop tanks had been. Tom Lanphier, upon landing, famously performed a victory roll over the field, a breach of discipline that signaled something monumental had occurred. He jumped from his cockpit and shouted to the onlookers, "I got that son of a bitch!" While the pilots celebrated, the atmosphere in the high command tents was one of quiet, agonizing tension. Admiral Nimitz and his staff knew that the success of the mission was only half the battle. Now they had to manage the intelligence fallout. The official report was scrubbed of any mention of magic or decrypted codes. The cover story was hastily released. Civilian coast watchers on the islands had spotted the planes, and a chance interception had occurred during a routine patrol. The Americans waited for a Japanese reaction. For weeks, the Japanese airwaves remained eerily silent regarding the admiral. They were searching the jungle. April 19th, 1943. The Bougainville jungle, a Japanese search party led by Army engineer Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Kono, hacked through the near-impenetrable undergrowth of the coastal rainforest. The heat was nearly 100 degrees with humidity so thick it felt like breathing water. They followed the smell of charred metal and aviation fuel until they reached a clearing. There lay the shattered remains of the Mitsubishi G4M1. The aircraft had plowed through the trees, tearing off its wings before slamming into the earth. The fuselage was scorched, but the cockpit area remained somewhat intact. Lieutenant Kono found Admiral Yamamoto still strapped into his seat. He was sitting upright, his white-gloved hand still gripping the hilt of his samurai sword, which rested between his knees. His head was bowed, as if in deep meditation. It was only upon closer inspection that the searchers saw the 2 bullet holes. One had entered his left shoulder, and the other had entered his lower jaw, and exited above his right eye. He had likely died instantly before the plane even hit the trees. The Japanese military was devastated. Yamamoto was more than a commander. He was the soul of the Imperial Navy. His death was kept a state secret for 37 days while his ashes were transported back to Japan aboard the battleship Musashi. When the news was finally broken to the Japanese public on May 21st, it was a national day of mourning. The Nelson of the East was gone. The removal of Yamamoto created a power vacuum that the Japanese Empire could never truly fill. His successor, Admiral Minichi Koga, was a capable officer, but he lacked Yamamoto's charisma, his intimate understanding of American industrial psychology, and his willingness to take massive strategic risks. More importantly, the mission proved the lethal reach of American land-based air power. The P-38 Lightning had done what no other fighter could. It had turned the vastness of the Pacific into a trap. The Japanese were forced to pull their high-ranking officers further back from the front lines, stifling leadership and slowing reaction times. Tactically, the mission sparked a decades-long controversy within the U.S. military. Both Rex Barber and Tom Lanphier claimed credit for the kill. Lanphier's account that he had shot the wing off the lead bomber in a high-speed dive differed from Barber's account of a steady tail chase. Decades later, forensic analysis of the wreckage and Japanese survivor testimony confirmed that Rex Barber's guns had delivered the fatal burst. In 2003, the Air Force partially settled the matter by awarding shared credit, though many historians and the American Fighter Aces Association eventually credited Barber with the sole kill. Operation Vengeance remains the longest-distance aerial intercept mission of the Second World War. It stands as a testament to the intersection of three pillars of American victory: signal intelligence, the ability to find the enemy in the noise of the radio waves; mathematical precision, the navigational genius required to meet a target in the middle of an ocean without GPS or radar; industrial engineering, the creation of the P-38, a machine that pushed the limits of range and firepower. The mission was a cold-blooded execution of strategic necessity. It was the first time in modern history that a specific enemy leader was targeted for assassination by a long-range military strike. It set a precedent for the targeted killings of the 21st century, proving that no commander, no matter how far behind the lines, was truly safe from a determined enemy with the right technology. Operation Vengeance successfully eliminated Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the most formidable strategic mind of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The loss severely hampered Japanese naval morale and leadership during the critical mid-war period. The mission remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war to protect the fact that the U.S. had broken Japanese codes. The P-38 pilots involved, particularly Mitchell, Barber, and Lanphier, became legends of the Pacific theater. Though the internal credit dispute lasted for 60 years, the wreckage of Yamamoto's Betty bomber still lies in the jungle of Bougainville today, a twisted monument of aluminum and steel slowly being reclaimed by the vines, a silent witness to the moment the American military proved that the Pacific was no longer a Japanese lake. We remember the 18 pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron who flew into the unknown on a mission with no margin for error. We honor the skill of the cryptanalysts who worked in the shadows to give the frontline fighters the edge they needed. Their combined efforts shortened the path to peace and changed the course of history in the Pacific. May we never forget the cost of vigilance and the weight of the decisions made in the silence of the Solomon Sea.